Our first inductee is the King, John Curtis Holmes.
Long before the adult film industry evolved into a billion-dollar, internet-driven empire that it is now, John Holmes was one of its first and most controversial icons. Rising from humble beginnings as an ordinary boy, Holmes transformed into one of the industry's most famous and infamous figures. But his journey was marred by addiction, entanglement in violent crime, and a tragic downfall that shook the very world he once dominated. You probably saw him on screen or heard about some of his later troubles, but today we'll unveil in all totality the real life and sad ending of John Holmes in this John Holmes documentary. This is one story you wouldn't want to skip. A messed-up childhood. John Curtis Esses was born on the 8th of August 1944 in Asheville, Ohio, into a family marked by instability and hardship. As the third child of Mary and Carl Esses, John's early life was fraught with challenges. His parents separated shortly after his birth, leaving Mary to raise her children largely on her own. The separation fractured the family foundation, setting the stage for a childhood that would be anything but stable. When Mary remarried Edward Holmes, John's life took another dramatic turn. Edward legally adopted John, and from that point forward, he became known as John Holmes. The Holmes household was deeply divided, shaped by the clash between a strict religious mother and an abusive, alcoholic stepfather. The family lived in government-subsidized housing in Columbus, Ohio. This cramped and modest living arrangement reflected the financial hardships they faced, with little room for comfort or security. The combination of poverty and domestic strife cast a long shadow over John's formative years, forcing him to develop a resilience born out of necessity rather than nurture. This is exactly why he walked the path that he did later in life. John's relationship with Edward Holmes was particularly fraught. Edward's alcoholism and violent outbursts created a volatile atmosphere that made the home feel more like a battleground than a sanctuary. Moreover, the tension between his mother and stepfather often placed John in difficult positions. The instability was further compounded when, after another parental divorce, Mary remarried Harold Bowman. This third marriage did little to ease John's feelings of neglect or to restore any semblance of family harmony. Instead, it introduced yet another complex relationship into his life. Throughout these early years, the constant upheaval and lack of a stable family environment profoundly impacted John Holmes. The emotional neglect and chaotic home life created internal conflicts that would later manifest in Holmes's struggles with addiction, self-worth, and identity. His early exposure to dysfunction shaped not only his character, but also his future path. Military service and move to Los Angeles. In 1960, at just 16 years old, John Curtis Holmes, still carrying the emotional weight of a fractured upbringing, decided to enlist in the U.S. Army. Since he was underage, this move required his mother, Mary Holmes's, written permission, which she granted, perhaps viewing the military as a path toward discipline and stability that her son had sorely lacked. For John, it was also an escape. The Army offered not only a structured environment far removed from his chaotic home in Columbus, Ohio, but also the promise of purpose, travel, and independence. Within a short time, he was deployed to West Germany, where he served in the Signal Corps, a branch responsible for military communications and support operations during the height of the Cold War. The Berlin Wall was erected in August 1961, just a year after Holmes's arrival. Despite being far from home and thrust into a foreign environment, Holmes adapted reasonably well to the discipline and order of military life. After 3 years of service, Holmes received an honorable discharge in 1963. Though not decorated or recognized for exceptional achievements, His service was steady, without serious infractions. However, like many veterans, Holmes found the transition back to civilian life challenging. He returned to the United States with no formal education beyond high school and few transferable skills that would guarantee employment. The military had provided structure and predictability, but civilian life demanded a different kind of resourcefulness, especially in an America undergoing dramatic cultural shifts during the early 1960s. Eager to start anew, Holmes made a bold move. Later in 1963, he relocated to Los Angeles, California. At the time, Los Angeles was a magnet for dreamers, actors, artists, musicians, and laborers, all seeking their version of the American dream. But the reality on the ground was much grimmer. Holmes quickly found himself struggling to make ends meet. He took on a variety of low-paying jobs, including stints as a door-to-door salesman, peddling brushes and household items, and factory work that offered little pay and even less stability. Without formal education, family connections, or a stable support system, he found it difficult to establish a career or even maintain steady employment. Still, Holmes showed a dogged determination to survive. He hustled his way through menial jobs, scraping together enough to pay rent and feed himself, while keeping an eye out for more lucrative opportunities. His physical appearance, tall, lanky, and clean-cut at the time, allowed him to blend into various work environments, but nothing seemed to stick. It was here, amid the shadows of Los Angeles's booming post-war economy, that Holmes would eventually make connections leading to his entry into the adult film industry. These early interactions were informal, often involving modeling gigs or softcore photography, but they planted the seeds for what was to come next. But it would be unfair to say that John Holmes did not try to find some sort of stability. Early adult life and marriage. In December 1964, Holmes crossed paths with Sharon Gebanini, a young, responsible nurse working in the Los Angeles area. Sharon was everything Holmes was not: disciplined, employed in a respected profession, and seemingly grounded. Their meeting was not exactly a sweeping romance, but Holmes, ever eager to establish something lasting and meaningful, saw in Sharon the promise of domestic life he had never truly known. By 1965 or early 1966, John and Sharon were married. Marriage offered Holmes a new identity, not just as a drifter or ex-army man, but as a husband. Sharon would go on to play a quiet but critical role in his personal and professional life, even as their relationship became increasingly strained by John's choices and behavior in the years to come. At the time of their union, however, the couple's life was humble. They lived in modest rented spaces, their income modest and barely sufficient. Sharon's job as a nurse provided the bulk of the couple's financial stability, especially as Holmes flitted between jobs that were physically demanding and poorly paid. One of Holmes's longest-lasting early jobs was as a forklift operator at a meat-packing plant. The work was grueling and cold, literally. The plant maintained sub-zero temperatures to preserve the meat, and Holmes, lacking proper protective gear and adequate rest, soon began experiencing chronic health issues. Frequent colds, respiratory problems, and fatigue plagued him. The repetitive labor, noise, and cold added layers of stress to a man already teetering on emotional instability. Still, he endured it for a time, seeing it as a necessary sacrifice to keep the household afloat, while Sharon took long shifts at local hospitals. Aside from the meat plant, Holmes juggled a variety of other jobs in quick succession. He worked briefly as an ambulance driver, a position that required long hours and intense emotional composure. He also went door to door selling household goods such as vacuum cleaners and brushes. This kind of work was unpredictable and emotionally draining. especially for someone with no professional background or sales training. Holmes also held factory positions and did odd jobs, reflecting the instability and underemployment that defined his early adulthood. Despite the patchwork nature of his employment, Holmes did his best to present a functional facade. With Sharon's steady income and his sporadic earnings, they managed to stay afloat. They shared meals, kept up appearances, and even discussed future aspirations. Sharon believed that with enough effort, her husband could find a steady path, perhaps in sales, skilled labor, or technical training. But Holmes, deeply affected by his chaotic childhood and haunted by a lack of identity, seemed restless. He longed for something more than just survival. He craved validation, success, and a sense of being special, however misguided that impulse would later prove. This period of Holmes's life, between 1964 and 1967, was a critical turning point. On the surface, he was a blue-collar worker trying to build a life with his wife in one of America's most opportunity-laden cities. Beneath that surface, however, Holmes was deeply dissatisfied and emotionally adrift. Though he had escaped the abuse and poverty of his upbringing, he had yet to find a meaningful purpose. The economic realities of the time didn't help. The mid-1960s were prosperous for many, but jobs for men without formal education or specialized training were either back-breaking or short-lived. Holmes fell into the category of the working poor, barely scraping by in a city of riches. As financial pressures mounted and his health declined, Holmes began to explore alternative ways to supplement his income. This would eventually lead him into the underbelly of Los Angeles, places where cash was quick, rules were few, and personal boundaries were blurred. His physical endowments, which he discovered to be unusually pronounced, became a topic of interest among photographers and adult modeling scouts. Although it would still be a few years before he fully entered the adult entertainment world, the seeds were being planted. Still, during those formative years, Sharon remained a stabilizing force. She would later say that despite his flaws, John was a charming, gentle man in private, someone who loved to read, who cared about appearances, who tried, in his own flawed way, to live up to the role of a husband. But even her support could not ultimately shield him from the weight of his past or the seductions of what lay ahead. Entry into the adult film industry. Financially strapped and physically drained, Holmes stumbled upon the burgeoning underground world of adult photography and stag films, a space where performers could make quick money without needing formal training or credentials. This was an era when pornographic content was still operating largely outside the law, distributed in 8mm loops, and shown in smoky back rooms of adult bookstores or private parties. Holmes, whose physical endowment soon became the stuff of myth, found himself in sudden demand within this niche but rapidly growing industry. His earliest forays into adult cinema consisted of softcore and hardcore loops, short, silent films that often lasted no more than 10 minutes and were shot on a shoestring budget. These projects required little in terms of acting, but served as an initiation for Holmes into the mechanics of adult filmmaking. He was known to work with low-budget producers like Joe Robertson and Bob Voss, the latter being the founder of the notorious talent agency World Modeling, which would later become a key player in the adult industry. Holmes's willingness to perform in increasingly explicit content and his distinct anatomical advantage helped him stand out in a pool of interchangeable male actors. Holmes's real break came in 1970 when director Bob Chin, a filmmaker who had transitioned from mainstream work to adult features, cast him in a new project titled The Italian Stallion. This was not to be confused with the 1969 film of the same name that starred Sylvester Stallone. Chin's version was a low-budget, semi-narrative adult feature that gave Holmes his first real taste of stardom within the underground scene. Recognizing Holmes's camera presence and confidence, despite his lack of formal training, Chin saw potential for a recurring character that could turn Holmes into a marquee name. It was around this time that Holmes adopted his now famous stage persona, Johnny Wad. The character was a sexually potent, street-smart private detective modeled after the hard-boiled crime heroes of 1940s noir fiction. Chin, heavily influenced by those pulp narratives, wrote Johnny Wad as the first in a series of adult detective films that blended crime, action, and explicit sex in a way that was novel for the genre. The character resonated immediately with audiences. The Johnny Wad series became a defining pillar of Holmes's career, eventually spanning at least 7 films over the next decade, including 1971's Flesh of the Lotus, 1976's Liquid Lips, and Tell Them Johnny Wad Is Here, which was also released the same year. This character launched Holmes into the higher echelons of adult stardom at a time when the industry itself was undergoing a major shift. By the mid-1970s, pornography was coming out of the shadows, thanks in part to the porno chic movement ushered in by films like Deep Throat and The Devil in Miss Jones. Adult features were being shown in actual theaters, receiving press coverage, and even being reviewed by mainstream critics. Holmes was perfectly positioned to ride this wave. He had the name recognition, the on-screen bravado, and, crucially, the backing of established adult filmmakers like Bob Chin and Paul Thomas. Thomas, another rising director in the industry, later cast Holmes in some of his most memorable roles, including the 1977 film Eruption, which attempted to blend psychological drama with explicit content. During this peak period, Holmes was a fixture in the adult film social scene. He frequented Hollywood's underground parties, mingled with both porn stars and minor celebrities, and became a kind of countercultural anti-hero. Behind the camera, however, the lines between his professional and personal life blurred dangerously. As his fame grew, so did his appetite for excess. The money, while never astronomical by mainstream Hollywood standards, was significantly better than what he had earned in his earlier years. Holmes indulged in fast living, expensive cars, multiple girlfriends, lavish parties, and, crucially, a growing addiction to illicit substances. The use of controlled substances became part of his daily existence by the late 1970s. The excesses of the adult film world, such as a lack of regulation, easy access to controlled substances, and constant sexual availability, created an ecosystem where boundaries ceased to exist. Holmes's behavior became increasingly erratic. He was notorious for arriving late on set, demanding higher pay, or failing to perform due to physical limitations induced by controlled substances. Directors like Bob Chin began to grow frustrated with him, though his name remained a box office draw. The persona of Johnny Wad had become inseparable from John Holmes, even as the man himself spiraled into addiction and delusion. Despite these personal challenges, Holmes remained a symbol of the adult film industry's golden era. His films had storylines, characters, and real production value. This was very rare in the genre prior to that time. Holmes was part of a larger movement that sought to legitimize adult cinema as a form of narrative filmmaking, even as many of its stars remained ostracized from mainstream society. However, by 1980, Holmes's star had begun to dim. The rise of video pornography meant that big-budget features were becoming rare, and performers were expected to work more frequently, for less money, in a much faster turnaround. Holmes, still using controlled substances heavily, was ill-equipped to adapt to this changing landscape. His reputation, once buoyed by charisma and mystique, now suffered under the weight of tabloid rumors, legal issues, and professional unreliability. Nonetheless, Holmes's entry and rise in the adult film industry left an indelible mark. He became one of the first true male pornographic celebrities. Yet this rise came at a cost. The very industry that had given Holmes purpose and fame would, in many ways, also enable his descent into addiction, crime, and tragedy, a journey that began, ironically, as a desperate bid to escape poverty. His personal life also suffered, personal relationships and marriages. Initially unaware of the nature of his work, Sharon Gabbanini, the first wife of John Holmes, eventually learned the truth about her husband's increasingly successful pornographic career. As Holmes's fame grew in the early 1970s, his marriage began to unravel under the strain of his double life. Sharon tolerated his career for some time, but eventually became disillusioned by the constant deception, the emotional distance, and his growing reliance on controlled substances. Their relationship, already under stress due to Holmes's unfaithfulness and financial irresponsibility, officially ended in divorce around 1973. Shortly before and after his divorce, Holmes became romantically involved with Dawn Schiller, a girl almost half his own age. Holmes first met Dawn in 1975 and started a deeply troubling and exploitative relationship that blurred the lines between lover, abuser, and manipulator. According to Schiller's later testimony and her 2012 memoir, The Road Through Wonderland, Holmes subjected her to both physical and psychological abuse. The relationship lasted for several years, during which Holmes's use of controlled substances escalated and his behavior became more erratic and violent. Despite the severe power imbalance and trauma she experienced, Schiller would remain entangled in his life until the early 1980s, even becoming a peripheral figure in the events leading up to the infamous Wonderland murders. In 1977, Holmes attempted to establish a more conventional relationship by marrying Laurie Rose, a woman who initially worked behind the scenes in the adult industry. At the time of their marriage, Holmes was already struggling with severe addiction to controlled substances and was embroiled in financial and legal troubles. The marriage was short-lived and volatile, characterized by infidelity, dishonesty, and Holmes's inability to maintain stability in any form. Although Laurie would later speak of loving Holmes and attempting to help him get clean, the relationship was ultimately unsustainable. Their union ended not long after it began, though Laurie would continue to support Holmes sporadically during his later years, especially during his battle with AIDS. Beyond these more formal relationships, Holmes developed a notorious reputation as a womanizer, engaging in numerous short-term affairs and liaisons, particularly with colleagues from the adult film world. Actresses and crew members from the industry have recounted stories of Holmes's flings, often describing him as both charming and manipulative. His relationships, even fleeting ones, were rarely rooted in emotional intimacy and often served to feed his ego or fulfill immediate needs. By the early 1980s, Holmes's reputation as a womanizer had become inseparable from his public image. However, this persona masked deeper issues: his growing dependency on controlled substances, his increasingly erratic behavior, and the emotional wreckage he left behind in nearly every romantic relationship. The disconnect between the legend and the man was perhaps best illustrated in the tragic aftermath of the Wonderland murders in 1981. It was during this time that his former lovers, particularly Dawn Schiller, began to speak out, painting a starkly different picture of a man once idolized as an icon. Holmes's downfall was to be as steep as his ascent to stardom. The infamous Wonderland Robbery. John Holmes's spiral into addiction and criminality was not sudden, but the product of years of escalating harmful substance uses and lifestyle excess. By 1981, Holmes owed significant amounts of money to Abdelkarib Nasrallah, better known as Eddie Nash, a Palestinian-born nightclub owner and harmful substance trafficker who had risen to power in the LA underworld. Nash, known for his control over the city's nightlife and narcotics trade, was feared and respected in equal measure. Holmes, whose substance use had outpaced his income, became financially and psychologically beholden to Nash, often serving as a courier or intermediary in exchange for controlled substances. At the same time, Holmes had begun associating with the Wonderland Gang, a group of career criminals based out of a home on 8763 Wonderland Avenue in the Laurel Canyon neighborhood. The gang, led by Ronnie Launius, Billy Deverill, and David Lind, was heavily involved in the trafficking of controlled substances and robberies. Holmes, needing cash and controlled substances, began frequenting the house, offering small tips and connections. His knowledge of Eddie Nash's habits and layout of his home made him valuable, and the gang soon began pressuring Holmes to help them rob Nash. Holmes eventually caved under pressure from both sides. Fear of Nash and the lure of controlled substances dangled by the Wonderland crew. He provided the gang with a hand-drawn map of Nash's heavily fortified Studio City home and confirmed the presence of valuables inside. On the morning of June 28, 1981, the Wonderland Gang used this information to launch a home invasion. Armed with firearms, they entered Nash's home through a side door Holmes had left unlocked. Once inside, they tied up Gregory Dials, Nash's 300-pound bodyguard, and began ransacking the property. During the assault, Dials was pistol-whipped and shot, although contrary to earlier reports, he survived the attack. The gang made off with an estimated $1.2 million in cash, controlled substances, jewelry, and weapons. While the heist was initially considered a success by its perpetrators, it was a catastrophic mistake in the eyes of Nash, who immediately suspected Holmes as the informant. Holmes had been spotted by Dials and Nash during the robbery and had not covered his tracks well. Nash, infuriated and vengeful, allegedly had Holmes brought to his residence and violently interrogated. Under duress and fearing for his life, Holmes ultimately led Nash's associates to the Wonderland Avenue house. Using information only he could have provided, such as alarm codes or floor plans, Holmes enabled what would become one of the most savage crimes in LA history. In the early morning hours of July 1, 1981, Nash's armed enforcers entered the Wonderland houses. The attack was gruesome. Ronnie Launius, his wife Susan Launius, who miraculously survived, Billy Deverill, Joy Miller, and Barbara Richardson were all bludgeoned in a display of extreme violence and retribution. John Holmes was also present during the massacre. According to later testimonies, including statements made by his estranged wife, Sharon Gebanini Holmes, he returned to her home afterward covered in blood and in a state of shock. He claimed to have been forced to witness the violent attack as punishment and as a warning. Sharon would later say he never emotionally recovered from what he saw that night. The fallout was immense. Legal troubles and court trials. The legal spotlight turned to Holmes in the immediate aftermath of the July 1, 1981 massacre at 8763 Wonderland Avenue. While Holmes was not initially arrested, investigators quickly connected him to both the victims and Eddie Nash. Holmes's prior involvement in facilitating the robbery of Nash's home just days earlier placed him squarely in the crosshairs of Los Angeles police detectives Tom Lang and Frank Tomlinson, who pursued leads in a case hampered by fear, silence, and a lack of physical evidence. On November 19, 1981, Holmes was arrested and charged with 4 counts of first-degree killing. The prosecution alleged that Holmes had either participated in the killings or had helped orchestrate them in league with Nash's enforcers. The trial began in 1982, drawing media attention not just for its gruesome subject matter, but because it featured a notorious adult film star facing the death penalty. However, the case against Holmes was plagued by the absence of direct evidence. The bloody palm print found at the crime scene belonged to Holmes, but his defense argued that he had touched the wall during a previous visit. The jury ultimately found the state's case inconclusive, and in June 1982, Holmes was acquitted of all killing charges. Despite his acquittal, Holmes's legal troubles were far from over. Under increasing pressure from law enforcement and facing possible future charges, Holmes agreed to testify under immunity in various proceedings related to the case. In exchange for his cooperation, Holmes provided behind-the-scenes details about the robbery at Nash's home and his coerced role in leading Nash's associates to the Wonderland house. This cooperation, however, placed him in grave danger. Holmes's estranged wife, Sharon Gebanini Holmes, later recounted how he lived in constant fear of retaliation, frequently relocating and avoiding public appearances. At the same time, Holmes found himself entangled in a host of legal battles related to the adult film industry. As the Reagan administration launched a nationwide crackdown on pornography in the early 1980s, Holmes became a frequent target of federal obscenity investigations. His films, particularly those produced by now-defunct companies like LA Video and Swedish Erotica, were seized in raids and used as examples in court cases testing the limits of First Amendment protections. While Holmes himself was never convicted of obscenity violations, he was regularly subpoenaed, and his past work was cited in efforts to increase regulation over adult film production and distribution. In addition to his public legal woes, Holmes was frequently embroiled in domestic conflicts stemming from his erratic behavior, emotional instability, and dependency on controlled substances. In 1982, he testified at Eddie Nash's trial. Though the trial was not directly related to the Wonderland murders, Holmes's testimony helped shed light on Nash's broader criminal activities, including trafficking of controlled substances and money laundering. While Nash was convicted on unrelated charges, the Wonderland killings remained officially unsolved for years. Holmes would never truly escape the consequences of his actions or associations. Despite his acquittal and legal immunity, his troubles were far from over. This next ordeal proved to be a bit too much. Declining health and AIDS diagnosis. By the mid-1980s, the once iconic John Curtis Holmes, the man whose name had been synonymous with adult film stardom, was spiraling into irreversible decline, both physically and mentally. Years of heavy controlled substance use, rampant alcoholism, and a disordered, transient lifestyle had taken a visible toll. Gone was the charismatic, mustachioed performer who had once captivated audiences. In his place remained a gaunt, hollow-eyed figure, often unkempt, paranoid, and no longer able to command the attention or admiration he once did. As his financial resources dwindled and industry opportunities vanished, Holmes began living out of cheap motels across North Hollywood and Van Nuys, often relying on acquaintances or fans for money and shelter. The most devastating blow, however, came in late 1986. Holmes was diagnosed with HIV. Such a diagnosis, at the time, was widely regarded as a death sentence. This was an era before the advent of effective antiretroviral therapy, and even the basic medical understanding of AIDS was limited and clouded by stigma. Fear and misinformation were rampant. Initially, he kept the diagnosis secret, even from close friends and his then-girlfriend Lori Rose, who would later become his second wife. Holmes's battle with AIDS was complicated by his refusal to fully give up controlled substances. His health steadily worsened. He suffered from persistent infections, dramatic weight loss, Kaposi's sarcoma lesions, and extreme fatigue. Despite occasional hospital stays, he remained largely untreated. Friends from the past, such as industry insiders like Bill Amerson and director Bob Chin, noted that Holmes became increasingly isolated, paranoid, and consumed by guilt over his past decisions. The adult film industry was quick to distance itself from its former icon, but it could not ignore his case altogether. Though the industry had operated with minimal regard for sexually transmitted infections in the 1970s and early 80s, his AIDS diagnosis served as a wake-up call. By the late 1980s, calls for mandatory HIV testing and safer sex protocols on adult film sets began to grow. Organizations such as the Adult Industry Medical Healthcare Foundation, founded later in the 1990s, would draw directly from cases like Holmes's to advocate for better performer health standards. As 1987 gave way to 1988, Holmes's condition became visibly unmanageable. Weighing under 100 pounds and suffering from pneumonia and dementia-like symptoms associated with end-stage AIDS, he was finally admitted to Veterans Hospital in Sepulveda, California, under the alias John C. Doe. It was there that Lori Rose, now legally his wife, stayed by his side during his final weeks. Despite everything, she remained with him, shielding him from media intrusion. As any faithful wife, she offered what little comfort she could to her husband. On March 13, 1988, John Holmes died of AIDS-related complications, just 43 years old. His body was cremated, and his ashes were scattered at sea. Though the world knew him as the face and body of an era, Holmes's final years were marked by suffering, regret, and a haunting reminder of the darker undercurrents that ran beneath the glitter of fame. Well, that's it for now. Thanks for watching. Did you like this video? If you did, please consider liking, dropping a comment, and hitting the subscribe button so that you don't miss out on our new uploads. Also, don't miss this video you see on your screen right now. It's truly unbelievable.